In 1923, a dying engineer named Walter Pembroke sketched something on his hospital bed that would haunt electrical historians for the next century. 3 diagrams, 17 equations, and a single sentence scrawled at the bottom that read, "They built them backwards on purpose." Pembroke wasn't just any engineer. He was the last living person who'd worked on the original high-voltage transmission towers built between 1891 and 1903. The towers that carried electricity across America before anyone understood how electricity actually worked at scale. And according to his deathbed drawings, every single tower built after 1903 was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what those original structures were actually doing. The drawings disappeared into a private collection. The equations were dismissed as the confused ramblings of a morphine-addled mind. And the American grid was built on a foundation that, according to Pembroke, was never meant to carry the load it eventually would. This is the story of the towers we forgot how to build, the engineer who tried to warn us, and the economic consequences of inheriting infrastructure we never truly understood. If you're into forgotten engineering, suppressed technical knowledge, or the hidden economics of infrastructure decay, hit subscribe. I cover one story like this every week, and this one goes deeper than you think. Walter Pembroke was born in 1849 in Pittsburgh, back when the city was still choking on coal smoke, and the idea of electric light was pure science fiction. His father ran a telegraph office. His mother died when he was 6. And by the time he was 14, Pembroke had rewired the entire office using principles he'd taught himself from borrowed physics textbooks and pure trial and error. In 1888, at 39 years old, Pembroke got hired by the Westinghouse Electric Company. Not because of his credentials, he had none, but because he'd solved a transformer problem that had stumped 3 of their senior engineers. The problem involved harmonic interference in AC systems. Pembroke's solution was elegant, unorthodox, and it worked. George Westinghouse hired him on the spot. 2 years later, Pembroke was in the mountains of Colorado, part of a team building the first long-distance high-voltage transmission line in America. The Ames hydroelectric plant to the Gold King mine, 14,000 volts across 2.6 miles of wilderness. Nobody had done this before. Nobody knew if it would work. And here's where things get strange. The towers they built for that line were not like the towers we use today. They were taller. The insulator configuration was different. The conductors were spaced in a pattern that, according to modern electrical engineering, makes no sense. And yet the line worked flawlessly for over 30 years. Pembroke spent the next 13 years building similar systems across the American West. Montana, Idaho, California, every time the same tower design, every time the same unusual conductor spacing, and every time the systems performed better than the theoretical models said they should. Then in 1903, something changed. The industry standardized. New engineers trained in the latest European electrical theory started redesigning the towers. They called Pembroke's designs primitive and inefficient. They introduced new configurations based on mathematical models that looked perfect on paper. Pembroke objected loudly. He insisted the old designs contained principles that the new theories didn't account for. He couldn't explain what those principles were, at least not in the language the new generation of engineers wanted to hear, but he knew the difference. He'd seen it in the field. He was overruled. By 1905, Pembroke was no longer building towers. He was relegated to maintenance work on the old lines. The industry had moved on, but Pembroke kept records, obsessive, meticulous records, performance data from every tower he'd ever built, voltage stability measurements, load distribution patterns, weather impact studies. He documented everything, convinced that one day someone would need to understand what the old towers were actually doing. That day never came, at least not in his lifetime. By 1920, Pembroke was 71 years old and living in a boarding house in Denver. The boarding house was 3 blocks from one of the original transmission lines he'd helped build in 1893. He walked to that tower every single day, sat beneath it, listened to the hum of the conductors. Neighbors thought he was senile. Maybe he was, but he was also paying attention to something nobody else was noticing. The old towers were aging differently than the new ones. They were quieter under load. They showed less corona discharge. And during electrical storms they behaved in ways that violated everything the textbooks said should happen. In early 1923, Pembroke was diagnosed with stomach cancer. He had maybe 3 months. He spent those months trying to get anyone, to listen to what he'd learned. He wrote letters to Westinghouse, to General Electric, to the newly formed National Electric Light Association. He offered his records, his data, his first-hand knowledge of the original designs. Nobody responded. The industry was booming. The grid was expanding at an exponential rate, and the last thing anyone wanted to hear was that they might be building it wrong. On June 14, 1923, Pembroke was admitted to Denver General Hospital. He was delirious, in pain, and according to the attending nurse, obsessed with the idea that he was running out of time. Not his own time, the grid's time. He asked for paper. The nurse brought him a notepad and a pencil, and over the next 6 hours Pembroke drew 3 diagrams and wrote 17 equations that, to this day, electrical historians can't fully decode. The first diagram showed a tower configuration with conductor spacing that violates Gauss's law, or at least it appears to. The spacing is asymmetrical in a way that should create massive imbalances in the electromagnetic field. But according to Pembroke's notes, this asymmetry was intentional. It was compensating for something he called terrestrial induction variance. That term doesn't exist in any electrical engineering textbook. Not in 1923. Not today. The second diagram showed what Pembroke called a resonant ground loop. It depicted a grounding system where the tower foundation wasn't just a passive electrical sink, it was an active part of the circuit. The diagram suggested that the old towers were using the earth itself as a kind of stabilizing capacitor, smoothing out voltage fluctuations that would otherwise destabilize the line. Modern engineers have looked at this diagram. Some have called it brilliant. Others have called it impossible. Nobody has successfully replicated it. The third diagram was the strangest. It showed a full transmission system, multiple towers, conductors and loads, but with an additional component that Pembroke labelled as atmospheric rectification nodes. These nodes were positioned at specific intervals along the line, and according to his notes they were essential for long-term system stability. There's no evidence these nodes were ever actually built, or if they were, nobody knows what they looked like. The equations Pembroke wrote were a mix of classical electromagnetism, thermodynamics and something else, something that doesn't fit neatly into any existing framework. Some of the variables he used aren't standard. Some of the relationships he described don't align with Maxwell's equations. And yet when electrical historians have tried to reverse engineer what Pembroke was calculating, they keep running into the same problem. His math predicts behaviours that shouldn't happen, but those behaviours match the real-world performance data from the old towers. At the bottom of the third page, Pembroke wrote that single sentence. They built them backwards on purpose. And then he added one more line. The load will exceed the design within 50 years. When it does, you'll see. He died 4 hours later. The drawings were collected with his personal effects and sent to his only surviving relative, a niece in Kansas City. She had no idea what they were. She kept them in a drawer for 30 years, then sold them to an antique dealer as part of an estate sale. The drawings ended up in the private collection of an electrical engineer named Howard Vickers, who'd spent his career studying early power systems. Vickers recognized Pembroke's name. He knew the significance of the original towers, and when he saw the diagrams he immediately understood that Pembroke had been trying to communicate something critical. Vickers spent the next 20 years trying to decode the drawings. He published 2 papers on his findings. Both were ignored. The electrical engineering community had long since moved on. The grid worked, power flowed, and nobody wanted to entertain the possibility that the foundation of the entire system was based on a misunderstanding. But here's the thing. Pembroke's prediction about the 50-year timeline? He was right. In 1973, exactly 50 years after his death, the American electrical grid began experiencing a new category of failure. cascading blackouts, voltage instability events, harmonic distortions that couldn't be explained by existing load models, the 1965 Northeast blackout, the 1977 New York blackout, the 2003 blackout that knocked out power for 50 million people. Every single one of these events involved failure modes that shouldn't have been possible according to the standard grid models, and every single one of them occurred in systems that had been built using the post-1903 tower designs. Meanwhile, the few remaining sections of grid that still used Pembroke's original tower configurations, they kept working, quietly, efficiently, with none of the unexplained instabilities that plagued the newer systems. Engineers noticed, quietly, behind closed doors. But publicly acknowledging that a 70-year-old design was outperforming modern infrastructure would have required admitting that the entire grid had been built on a flawed premise. So instead they patched. They added compensators, stabilizers, monitoring systems, layers upon layers of complexity trying to fix problems that the old towers apparently didn't have. In 2004, a team of engineers from MIT and Caltech conducted a detailed analysis of one of the last remaining original Pembroke towers still in operation. The tower was in Montana, part of a small rural co-op that had never upgraded their infrastructure. The analysis confirmed what Pembroke had been trying to say. The old towers were doing something the new towers weren't. They were interacting with the Earth's natural electromagnetic field in a way that provided passive stability. The asymmetrical conductor spacing wasn't a mistake. It was a feature. It created a kind of electromagnetic damping effect that absorbed voltage fluctuations before they could propagate through the system. The grounding system wasn't just grounding, it was coupling the tower to telluric currents, natural electrical flows in the Earth's crust, and using those currents to regulate the line's behavior. And those atmospheric rectification nodes Pembroke had drawn, the researchers found physical evidence of them. Small metal structures positioned at intervals along the original lines that appeared to serve no obvious function, until you measured the electromagnetic field around them. Then it became clear they were acting as passive voltage regulators using atmospheric ionization to bleed off excess charge. None of this was accidental. Pembroke and the other early engineers had discovered these effects through empirical observation. They didn't have the theory to explain it, but they had the data, and they built accordingly. When the industry standardized in 1903, that empirical knowledge was discarded, and the new engineers trusted the theory more than the data, and the grid was rebuilt on foundations that looked correct mathematically, but ignored the real-world phenomena the old designs had been compensating for. The economic cost of this mistake is hard to calculate, but consider this. The US police spends over $50 billion a year on grid stabilization, monitoring, and failure prevention. Technologies that attempt to solve problems the original towers apparently didn't have. And despite all that spending, the grid is less stable now than it was in 1950. Meanwhile, the handful of utilities still operating Pembroke-era infrastructure report significantly lower maintenance costs, fewer outages, and better long-term performance than the industry average. There's a lesson in here about the difference between understanding something and being able to explain it. Pembroke understood how to build stable transmission systems. He couldn't explain it in the theoretical language of his time, so he was dismissed, and the knowledge he carried died with him. Today, engineers are trying to reverse engineer what Pembroke knew, using modern materials science, electromagnetic field analysis, and computational modeling to recreate the performance characteristics of towers built by men who worked with slide rules and intuition. Some of that research is succeeding. New tower designs incorporating asymmetrical conductor spacing and enhanced grounding systems are showing the same stability improvements Pembroke documented over a century ago. But the grid is already built. Replacing it would cost trillions. So instead, we keep patching, keep adding complexity, keep building on a foundation that a dying engineer tried to warn us about in 1923. Walter Pembroke's drawings are still in Howard Vicker's collection. They've been digitized, studied, debated, and they remain even now only partially understood. Because the knowledge Pembroke was trying to preserve wasn't just technical, it was experiential. It was the accumulated wisdom of engineers who built systems by watching how they behaved, not by calculating how they should behave. That kind of knowledge doesn't transfer well through diagrams and equations. It transfers through apprenticeship, through direct experience, through generations of engineers working on the same systems, learning their quirks, understanding their rhythms. We don't build infrastructure that way anymore. We build it fast, cheap, and according to models. And when reality doesn't match the models, we assume reality is wrong. Pembroke knew better. He spent his last hours trying to tell us. We just weren't listening. That's it. If this made you rethink how we build infrastructure, I've got more like it. Next week, the concrete formula they used to build the Hoover Dam that modern engineers can't replicate. Click the video on screen. I'll see you there.